What would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for decided you were no longer worth keeping? It was a cold evening in New York. Snow pressed softly against the windows as Robert, a 70-year-old retired engineer, sat alone in his chair, slowly flipping through old family photos. Each picture held a memory, a life that once felt full. Then his son David walked in. "Dad, we've been thinking," he said, his voice uneasy. "With work, the kids, everything's just too much. We can't take proper care of you anymore. We found a place, Sunshine Care Home. It's really good. You'll be comfortable there." The cold evening settled quietly over New York, wrapping the city in a heavy blanket of silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft whisper of winter wind against the windows. Inside a modest home, Robert sat alone in his favorite armchair, the same one he had used for years, its cushions slightly worn but still comforting. A small lamp beside him cast a warm, golden glow that barely pushed back the shadows in the room. In his hands, he held an old photo album, its edges faded with time, filled with moments that once made his world feel whole. He turned each page slowly, carefully, as if afraid that rushing might somehow erase the memories printed on them. There were pictures of his younger days, standing proudly beside his wife, both of them smiling with a kind of happiness that only existed in those simpler times. His fingers paused on one photo longer than the others, a picture of David as a child, sitting on his shoulders, laughing freely without a care in the world. Robert's eyes softened as he looked at it, and for a moment, the quiet room seemed to fill with echoes of that laughter. The house itself felt different now. It was still the same place, the same walls, the same furniture, but something important was missing. The energy, the warmth, the life that once flowed through every corner had slowly faded over the years. After his wife passed away, the silence had grown heavier, stretching longer with each passing day. Robert had learned to live with it, to accept it as part of his routine, but some nights, like this one, it pressed a little harder on his chest. Outside, snow began to fall, light at first, then steadily covering the streets in a thin layer of white. The world beyond his window looked distant, almost unreachable, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Robert leaned back in his chair, holding the album close, drawing a quiet sense of comfort from the memories it carried. Each photograph told a story of sacrifice, of love, of years spent building a life centered around his family. He remembered the long hours he had worked, often taking on extra shifts just to make sure David had everything he needed. There were days he returned home exhausted, barely able to stand, yet still finding the strength to help with homework, to listen, to be present. Every decision he made back then had one purpose: to give his son a better life than he ever had. Now, sitting alone in the dim light, those years felt both close and distant at the same time, like a dream that had quietly slipped away. The ticking clock on the wall marked each passing second, steady and unchanging, a quiet reminder that time had moved forward whether he was ready or not. Robert closed the album for a moment, resting his hand gently on its cover, as if holding on to something fragile that could disappear if he let go. The quiet in the house lingered, heavy and unmoving, as Robert sat with the photo album resting in his lap. The soft glow of the lamp flickered slightly, casting faint shadows along the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in silence. Inside, there was a different kind of stillness, the kind that settles deep in the heart. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway. Robert looked up slowly as David appeared at the doorway. He stood there for a moment, as if unsure whether to step in or turn back. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his shoulders slightly tense. There was something in his expression, hesitation, discomfort, maybe even guilt, but it was quickly hidden behind a controlled, careful look. "Dad," David finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. Robert straightened a little in his chair, closing the album gently and setting it aside. "Yes," he replied, calm but attentive. David walked into the room, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he paced slightly, glancing around as though searching for the right words. The distance between them felt larger than the room itself. "We've been talking," David said, choosing each word carefully. "Me and Catherine about things at home. About everything." Robert remained silent, watching him. "You know how busy things have gotten," David continued. "Work has been intense lately, and the kids have their school activities. Soccer practice almost every day. It's just a lot to manage." He paused, avoiding eye contact, then continued, "And we've been thinking about you too. About your needs, your comfort." Robert's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, though his face stayed composed. David took a breath, then finally said it. "We don't feel like we're able to give you the care you deserve anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "There's this place," David added quickly, almost as if trying to soften the impact. "Sunshine Care Home. It's one of the best around. They have professional staff, medical support, people your age. It's actually a really good environment." Robert listened without interrupting. His eyes stayed on his son, but something behind them had shifted. Something quiet, something deeply personal. "You'd be more comfortable there," David went on. "You'd have everything you need, and we'd visit, of course. It's not like we're leaving you. It's just a better arrangement." The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the lamp. For a brief moment, Robert's mind drifted, through years of memories, sacrifices, moments that had defined his life as a father. He thought about the nights he stayed awake, when David was sick, the endless hours he worked, the dreams he set aside just to make sure his son never felt less than anyone else. And now, here they were. He returned to the present, his expression steady, his voice calm. "If that's what you think is best," Robert said quietly, "then I'll be ready tomorrow." David looked slightly relieved, though a flicker of discomfort still lingered in his eyes. He nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if eager to move past the moment. "Thank you, Dad. I really think this is the right decision." Robert gave a small nod in return, saying nothing more. David turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway until the house was silent again. Robert remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead, unmoving. The album sat beside him, untouched now, as if the memories inside it belonged to a different life. The same walls surrounded him, the same furniture, the same quiet space, but everything felt changed, as though something invisible had shifted beyond repair. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last. Robert remained in his chair for a while after David left, staring quietly at the empty space in front of him. The house felt unusually still, as if even the walls had absorbed what had just happened. After some time, he reached for the photo album again, then paused, his hand hovering over it before gently pulling back. He leaned back in his chair instead, closing his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to escape the weight pressing on his thoughts. When he finally stood up, it was with a calm, deliberate movement. There was no rush, no sign of panic, just a quiet acceptance that settled over him like the cold outside. He walked slowly toward his bedroom, his footsteps soft against the floor, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence any further. Every corner of the house carried a memory, every object a reminder of years that had passed, and as he moved through it, it felt less like leaving a home and more like stepping away from a life he had built piece by piece. Inside his room, he opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. It was old, slightly worn at the edges, but still sturdy. He placed it on the bed and stood there for a moment, looking at it, as if deciding what part of his life could fit inside something so small. Then, quietly, he began to pack. He folded his clothes neatly, placing them one by one into the suitcase. A few shirts, a sweater, some personal items, only the essentials. There was no need for more. He moved with care, not because he had to, but because every action carried a quiet sense of finality. At one point, he picked up a framed photograph from the bedside table. Him and his wife, standing close together, smiling at the camera. He held it for a few seconds, his thumb gently brushing the edge of the frame, then placed it carefully between his clothes. The house remained silent through the night. No one came to check on him. No one asked if he needed help. The distance that had begun in a single conversation now felt complete. When morning came, the light filtered softly through the curtains, pale and cold. Robert was already awake. He sat on the edge of the bed. Fully dressed, his suitcase closed beside him. There was no sign of hesitation in his expression, no visible struggle, just a quiet stillness that came from making peace with something painful. He stood up, took one last look around the room, and then picked up his suitcase. As he walked through the house, he slowed near the living room, glancing briefly at the chair where he had spent so many evenings. The lamp was still there, the photo album resting beside it, untouched since the night before. For a moment, he considered going back, opening it again, holding on to those memories just a little longer. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, each step steady, each movement controlled, as if he had already accepted that some chapters in life close quietly, without warning, without resistance. The morning air was sharp and cold as Robert stepped outside, his breath faintly visible in the winter chill. The sky was pale, the kind of quiet gray that made everything feel distant and still. David was already in the car, the engine running, a thin cloud of exhaust rising behind it. He glanced up briefly as Robert approached, then looked away. His hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel, Robert placed his suitcase in the back without a word and slowly got into the passenger seat. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing them inside a silence that felt heavier than anything either of them could say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The car pulled away from the house, tires crunching lightly over the thin layer of snow, covering the driveway. As they drove through the quiet streets, the world outside seemed muted. Snow rested on rooftops, clung to tree branches, and softened the edges of everything it touched. People moved in the distance, bundled in coats, going about their lives, unaware of the quiet tension inside the car passing by. Inside, the silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional sound of tires rolling over the road. Robert sat with his hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed ahead. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but his eyes carried a quiet depth, as if they were holding back thoughts too heavy to speak. David kept his focus on the road, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened and relaxed, betraying the unease he couldn't quite hide. Minutes passed like this, slow and steady, until Robert finally spoke. "David." His voice was soft, but it filled the space between them. David glanced at him briefly, then back at the road. "Yes. Before we get there, can we make a stop?" There was a slight pause. "Where?" David asked, his tone cautious. Robert turned his head slightly, looking out the window, as if searching for something familiar in the passing streets. "The Golden Diner," he said quietly. "It's been a long time. I thought maybe we could have one last lunch together." The words hung gently in the air, not demanding, not heavy, just simple and sincere. David hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, and for a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. They were already on their way, already committed to a decision that felt easier when it was moving forward without interruption. Stopping meant slowing down, thinking, feeling, things he had been trying to avoid. But then something shifted. "Okay," David said finally, his voice quieter now. "We can stop." Robert gave a small nod, his gaze returning to the window. Outside, the city continued to move, but now it felt slightly closer, slightly more real. The car changed direction, turning toward a part of town filled with older buildings and familiar streets. As they drove, memories seemed to settle quietly between them. The Golden Diner wasn't just a place, it was a piece of their past. A place where simple meals had once been shared, where laughter came easily, where life felt less complicated. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt it. The weight of what that stop meant, the unspoken understanding that this wasn't just about food, but about something deeper, something that had been left behind and was now waiting to be faced. The car slowed as they pulled up in front of the Golden Diner. Its old sign still hanging above the entrance, slightly faded but familiar. Snow had gathered along the edges of the sidewalk, and the windows were lightly fogged from the warmth inside. For a moment, neither of them moved. The engine idled quietly, and the world outside felt still, as if waiting. David turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Robert reached for the door handle and stepped out slowly, taking in the sight of the diner. It hadn't changed much. The same glass door, the same narrow windows, the same feeling of something that had lasted through time. He stood there briefly, as if collecting a piece of himself from the past, then walked inside. A soft bell rang as the door opened. Warm air wrapped around them instantly, carrying the scent of coffee and grilled food. The low hum of conversation filled the space, mixed with the clinking of dishes and the quiet shuffle of movement. It was simple, ordinary, but it held a comfort that felt almost forgotten. Robert's eyes moved across the room, recognizing small details, the counter stools, the worn booths, the familiar layout. Without saying anything, he walked toward a booth near the window and sat down. It was the same one they used to sit in years ago. David followed, sliding into the seat across from him, For a moment, neither spoke. A waitress approached, offering a polite smile as she placed 2 menus on the table. They ordered without much thought. Coffee, something simple to eat. Once she left, the quiet returned. Robert rested his hands on the table, his fingers gently touching the surface, as if feeling something beneath it. His gaze drifted for a second, lost somewhere between memory and the present. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket. David watched him, a slight tension building in his chest. Robert pulled out an old envelope. It looked worn, the edges slightly creased, as if it had been carried for a long time. He placed it gently on the table between them. David frowned slightly. "What's that?" Robert looked at the envelope for a moment, then back at his son. "My estate papers," he said calmly. David leaned forward a little, curiosity mixing with unease. Robert opened the envelope slowly, taking out a few folded documents. He didn't rush. Every movement was steady, deliberate, as if he wanted each second to settle fully into the moment. "You remember the house in the Hamptons?" Robert asked. David nodded quickly. "Of course. The one worth around $5 million. Robert added, his voice even. "Yes," David replied, now fully focused. Robert paused briefly, then placed the papers flat on the table. "I made a decision this morning," he said quietly. "I've arranged for it to be donated to a charity for homeless veterans." The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. David blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "What?" he said, almost under his breath. Robert didn't look away. His face remained calm, but there was something firm beneath that calmness, something that made it clear this wasn't a casual statement. David's eyes dropped to the papers, then back to his father. The air between them tightened, the quiet now filled with something unspoken, but impossible to ignore. David stared at the papers on the table, as if they might change if he looked long enough. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. For a moment, the sounds of the diner faded into the background. The clinking of plates, the low conversations, the movement of people, all of it distant, almost unreal. What are you saying?" he finally managed, his voice tight. Robert remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the table, his expression steady. "I've decided to donate the house," he repeated quietly. David shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips, as if this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. "No, Dad, that doesn't make sense. That house, that's everything. That's been in our family for years." Robert said nothing. David leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. "You can't just give it away. That's not just your decision. It affects all of us. It's our future." The word hung in the air. Robert's eyes lifted slowly to meet his son's. "Our future," he said, his tone calm but carrying a weight that made David pause. "Yes," David insisted, though his confidence wavered under his father's gaze. "I mean, it's something you worked for, something you built. It's supposed to stay in the family." Robert's fingers moved slightly, adjusting the papers in front of him. He looked down at them briefly, then back up again. "I did work for it," he said, "every bit of it." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "I worked long hours, missed sleep, gave up things I wanted, all to build something that would secure a future for my family." David shifted in his seat, the words beginning to settle in ways he hadn't expected. That's why it matters, David said quickly. That's exactly why you shouldn't give it away. Robert leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. And what is it that matters to you, David? He asked. The question caught him off guard. I just told you, David replied, though his tone had softened. It's our future. It's security. It's important. Robert studied him for a moment, as if searching for something deeper beneath the words. Is it? He asked quietly. David frowned, confusion mixing with frustration. Of course it is. Robert let out a slow breath, not of anger, but of understanding, an understanding that seemed to come from something far deeper than the conversation itself. So when you decided to send me away, he said, his voice even, was that about my future too? The question hit harder than anything before. David froze. That's different, he said quickly. This isn't about that. This is about making sure you're taken care of. Robert nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the words without fully accepting them. And giving away the house, that's about making sure others are taken care of, he replied. David's hands tightened on the edge of the table. But you're giving up something huge, he said, his voice strained now. Something that belongs to us. Robert's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet shift in his eyes, something sharper, something clearer. To us, he repeated softly. The distance between them felt wider now, filled with everything that hadn't been said, everything that was only now beginning to surface. Something that neither of them could ignore anymore. Robert let the silence sit between them for a moment, giving the weight of the conversation time to settle. The noise of the diner slowly returned, dishes clinking, low voices blending together, but at their table, everything felt still. He looked at David carefully, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity that came from years of understanding. More than he ever said out loud. When you were a child, Robert began slowly, you didn't have to earn anything from me. You didn't have to prove your worth. David lowered his gaze slightly, unsure of where this was going. You needed something and I gave it. Robert continued. Food, shelter, education, my time, my energy. Everything I had, I gave it without asking what I would get in return. His voice remained calm, but there was a depth to it now that made it harder to ignore. I never once looked at you and thought about what you could give me someday, he added. I only thought about what you needed in that moment. David swallowed, his fingers tightening together as he listened. Robert leaned forward just slightly, his eyes steady. But somewhere along the way, things changed, he said. Not all at once, just slowly. David shifted in his seat, his chest feeling heavier with each word. I got older, Robert went on, and I stopped being useful in the way you understood value. I wasn't earning anymore. I wasn't providing in the same way. He paused briefly, letting that thought settle, and without even realizing it, you started seeing me differently. David shook his head lightly. No, that's not. Robert raised his hand gently, not to silence him harshly, but to hold the moment where it was. Let me finish, he said softly. David stopped. I'm not saying you stopped loving me, Robert continued. But love started to come with conditions. The words landed quietly, but they carried a sharp truth. You became busy, distracted, focused on your own life, your own responsibilities, Robert said. And that's natural. That's part of growing up. He glanced briefly at the papers on the table, then back at David. But when I needed you the way you once needed me, your solution wasn't to make space. It was to find somewhere else to put me. David's eyes filled with emotion, but he said nothing. Robert's voice softened slightly. That's when I understood something, he said. To you, I had become a responsibility, something to manage. He took a slow breath. And when a person becomes a responsibility instead of a relationship, their value starts to fade. David looked down, unable to meet his father's eyes. So this house, Robert continued, gesturing lightly toward the papers, this money, this future you're talking about. He paused again, choosing his words carefully. It only matters to you because it still holds value, he said. But I wanted to see something else. David looked up slowly. I wanted to see if I still had value. Without it, Robert finished quietly. The truth hung in the air, undeniable now, no longer hidden behind explanations or justifications. David sat frozen, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him from every direction. For the first time since they had walked into the diner, he had no argument, no explanation ready to protect himself. Everything Robert had said echoed in his mind, repeating with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. The truth wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet, steady, and undeniable. His eyes dropped to the table, but the papers were no longer what held his attention. Instead, memories began to surface, uninvited and overwhelming. Moments he hadn't thought about in years came rushing back. His father coming home late at night, still managing to smile, still asking about his day. Weekends spent together, simple things that had once meant everything. Sacrifices he had never truly seen for what they were. A tightness formed in his chest. I didn't go. David began, but the words didn't come out right. He paused, swallowing hard, trying again. I didn't realize. His voice broke slightly, and he looked up, his eyes now filled with emotion he could no longer hide. I didn't see it like that, he said, more honestly this time. I thought I was doing the right thing, making sure you were taken care of. Robert watched him quietly, saying nothing. But I see it now, David continued, his voice trembling. I see how it must have felt, like I was pushing you away, like you didn't matter anymore. The realization hit deeper with every word he spoke. His hands moved slightly on the table, restless, unsure, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. I got so caught up in everything, he admitted. Work, responsibilities, trying to keep everything together. I didn't stop to think about what I was losing in the process. He shook his head slowly, regret filling every part of his expression. And I didn't think about what you gave up for me, he added. All those years, everything you did. I just took it for granted. Robert's gaze remained steady, but there was a softness there now, a quiet understanding. I'm sorry, Dad, David said, the words coming out heavier than anything he had said before. I'm really sorry. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't cold or distant. It was full, meaningful, carrying weight at what had finally been understood. David leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, but more certain. Please don't go to that place, he said. Come back home with me. Not because of anything you have, not because of the house, but because you're my father." His eyes held onto Robert's, not looking away this time. "I want you there," he continued. "I want to make it right." Robert studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something deeper than words, something real, something lasting. Then, slowly, the tension in his expression eased, and a faint smile appeared. "I never signed the papers," Robert said quietly. David blinked, caught off guard. "What?" he asked softly. Robert's smile remained gentle. "I never gave the house away," he continued. "I just needed to understand something, and I needed you to understand it too." David stared at him, the realization settling in gradually. "You mean this was all?" he began, but didn't finish. Robert nodded slightly. "I needed to know if my son was still there," he said. The words landed softly, but they carried a quiet relief. David exhaled slowly, emotion still heavy in his chest, but now mixed with something else. Gratitude, and a chance to change what almost slipped away. Robert reached across the table, placing his hand gently over David's. "Let's go home," he said quietly. There are moments in life when everything seems ordinary on the surface, yet something deep beneath begins to shift, quietly changing the way we see the people around us. We move through our routines, balancing responsibilities, chasing stability, trying to build a future, often believing we are doing what is right. But in that constant motion, it becomes easy to overlook the very people who once made our lives possible, the ones who stood behind us when we had nothing, who carried burdens we never even noticed, who gave without expecting anything in return. Parents never measure their love in terms of benefit or reward. They don't calculate how much they give or what they will receive later. Their sacrifices are silent, often invisible, woven into the foundation of our lives so deeply that we grow up standing on them without even realizing it. Every opportunity, every comfort, every small moment of security often comes from years of effort that were never to be seen as a transaction. It was never about value or usefulness. It was about love in its purest form. As time passes, roles begin to change. The ones who once protected us grow older, slower, quieter. Their needs become simpler, yet somehow heavier in our eyes. What was once given freely to us begins to feel like something difficult to return. Not because we don't care, but because we allow the noise of life, work, pressure, responsibilities, to convince us that there isn't enough space, enough time, enough energy. Without realizing it, we start to see them differently, not as the center of our world, but as something that needs to be managed, adjusted, or placed somewhere convenient. That shift doesn't happen in a single moment. It builds gradually, hidden in small decisions, in postponed conversations, in choices that seem practical, but slowly create emotional distance. And by the time we notice it, something important has already begun to fade. The connection that once felt unbreakable becomes fragile, not because love disappeared, but because it was no longer expressed in the way it needed to be. It is easy to replace time with solutions, to replace presence with arrangements, to believe that providing comfort is the same as offering care. But true care is not just about meeting needs. It is about being there, about recognizing the emotional weight behind someone's silence, about understanding that what they seek is not convenience, but connection. No place, no service, no arrangement can replace the feeling of belonging, of being wanted, of being valued simply for existing. We often think there will always be more time to fix things, more chances to say what we didn't say, to give what we didn't give. But time doesn't pause, and opportunities don't wait. The moments we overlook today become the regrets we carry tomorrow. And unlike money or success, those moments cannot be earned back once they are gone. What truly matters is not what someone leaves behind, but how they were made to feel while they were still present. Not the inheritance they give, but the respect and love they receive, because, in the end, relationships are not built on what we gain from each other, but on what we are willing to give without expecting anything in return. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you never miss more powerful and emotional stories like this.